Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Dark Narrations. Tonight, we journey deep into the ancient heart of the Appalachian Mountains with one of the most disturbing collections of true hunter horror stories ever recorded. In this episode, you're about to hear 9 bone-chilling encounters pulled straight from the experiences of those who dared to step into these rugged, shadow-soaked wildernesses and came face to face with something far beyond human understanding. These are not campfire tales polished for entertainment. These accounts come directly from hunters who vanished off marked trails, trackers who sensed eyes watching them from the tree line, and outdoorsmen who discovered that some predators in the Appalachians walk on 2 legs and were never meant to be seen. From abandoned ridgelines where footsteps echo with no source, to remote hollows where locals warn outsiders not to whistle after dark, to dense forests where ancient forces are said to move silently between the trees. Every story you hear tonight comes from real people who survived the kind of terror most never speak of again. For their safety and privacy, a few names and specific locations have been changed, but the horrifying truth of each encounter remains untouched. These mountains have guarded their darkness for centuries, and tonight, you'll understand why some hunters never return, and why those who do carry a silence that cannot be broken. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button for more true horror stories that will haunt your nights and make you rethink the shadows around you, and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss when the darkness of these mountains calls out again. I knew something was wrong the moment the wind brushed against my face that morning, colder than it should have been, sharper, almost whispering as it moved past my ears. I'd grown up in these Appalachian woods, raised on the belief that the mountains protected those who respected them, yet the quiet clinging to the trees felt unnatural, like the forest was holding its breath. As I tightened my pack strap and lifted my grandfather's .306 rifle, an uneasy tremor settled inside my chest, one I tried to ignore, but deep down a voice, small, strained, instinctive, kept repeating the same warning: something is watching you. I told myself it was just nerves, the kind that come when life pulls you too far from yourself for too long. The hospital job had worn me down that year, endless shifts, emergency calls, faces of people I couldn't save lingering in dreams. Hunting had always been my reset button, a return to something real and grounding. So I took a week off, drove up the old logging road, and hiked 2 miles until the familiar ridge opened in front of me. The November air carried the scent of damp leaves and cold stone. It felt like home, and for a while, that comfort washed over me. I brewed coffee, watched mist drift between the pines, and breathed the silence like medicine. But as the days passed, that silence deepened into something else, something heavier. By the 3rd morning, the forest felt hollow, as though every small creature had slipped away from a danger they sensed, but I didn't. My boots crunched across frozen leaves, echoing far too loudly through the stillness, and every step made the back of my neck prickle. I tried to blame the cold, the season, anything logical, but the truth gnawed at me. Too much silence in the mountains is a warning one every hunter knows. And as the sun climbed over the ridge, stretching pale light through the trees, the dread inside me sharpened into something undeniable. When I finally reached the old tree stand, I stopped short. At the base of the tree, my tree, was a campsite that didn't belong. The fire pit was still warm beneath the ash, and the gear scattered around it looked torn apart in some frantic, violent fury. A sleeping bag shredded, cans crushed under a heavy boot, dark, dried blood soaked into the leaves, thick enough that I felt it tighten the back of my throat. At first, I worried someone was injured and nearby, but the lack of any trail, any signs of struggle leading away, made my stomach twist. This wasn't an accident or an animal attack. This was deliberate. And then I saw the message carved into the nearest tree, jagged letters slashed deep into the bark: "He is watching." The words felt fresh, wrong, desperate. I stepped back automatically, my hand tightening around my pistol even though I didn't remember drawing it. Every shadow looked too tall, every branch too still. I scanned the tree line, forcing slow breaths, telling myself I was just spooking over nothing. But that message hummed beneath my ribs like a warning I was already too late to hear. Still, habit and stubbornness made me climb the tree stand. I told myself I'd stay only long enough to understand what I'd found. But once I settled in, I realized I wasn't listening for deer anymore. I was listening for footsteps, branches cracking, a breath that wasn't mine. Every small sound became a threat, until the forest gave me something that wasn't small at all. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, heavy, moved from the direction I had come. My pulse slammed against my throat as I pressed myself against the rough bark, trying to vanish into the tree. The crunch of leaves grew louder, closer, until a man stepped through the thinning mist. Tall, filthy, beard tangled, jacket stained with dirt and something darker, and cradled in his arms was an AR-style rifle, its long magazine glinting in the faint morning sun. He paused at the ruined campsite, staring at it with a stillness that made my blood freeze. Then, slowly, almost as if he'd heard my heartbeat thundering in the tree stand, he lifted his face not toward me, but toward the trees just beyond me, scanning the woods like he already knew someone was there. I held my breath until my lungs burned. I watched him through my scope, every instinct screaming for me to run, to hide, to vanish, but I couldn't move. His presence pinned me in place like a nail through bone. And then, he smiled. It wasn't a human smile. It was thin, crooked, knowing, like he could already see the fear shaking inside me even though he hadn't looked directly at me. From his jacket, he drew a serrated hunting knife and began carving something into another tree with slow, deliberate strokes. The sound of blade on bark echoed through the cold air like a warning I was helpless to understand. When he finally finished, he stepped back, admired his work, and walked into the forest without a single glance behind him. I waited 20 minutes before climbing down, 20 minutes of trembling, breathless fear. When I saw what he carved, my knees nearly buckled. A list of names, 7 names, most I didn't know. One I did, a hunter who vanished 2 years ago. Then silence swallowed everything. My legs carried me before my mind caught up, stumbling through the underbrush as the cold air scraped my throat raw. Every snapped twig behind me felt like a footstep. Every shadow felt like a figure closing in. My pack thudded against my spine as I pushed through the trees, gripping my rifle tight enough to bruise my palms. The forest no longer felt familiar, it felt alive, aware, watching every desperate breath I took. And somewhere in that suffocating stillness, I swore I heard leaves shift in a rhythm too steady to be the wind, as if someone was pacing me from deeper in the woods. The trail bent, and for a moment I forced myself to slow, listening hard. Nothing, no birds, no branches creaking, not even the rustle of the cold November wind. Just silence, stretching so long it felt like a rope pulled tight around my chest. I hated that silence, hated how it made me wonder whether he was already ahead of me, waiting behind the next stand of trees. My mind kept replaying that smile, the twisted curve of it, the quiet satisfaction in his eyes. I couldn't shake the fear that he carved those names while knowing I was close enough to find them. I pushed faster, my breath coming sharp and uneven as frost clung to my lashes. My boots skidded across a patch of slick leaves, sending me crashing to one knee. Pain shot up my leg, but I forced myself upright, unwilling to give the forest even a second to swallow me. Trees blurred past in streaks of brown and gray. The ridge dipped lower, and every step made me wonder, what if he was tracking me the whole time? What if he had carved that list, knowing I'd see it, knowing fear would drive me exactly where he wanted me to go? The idea lodged itself in my throat so hard I couldn't swallow around it. The logging road finally came into view, a thin line of relief between the dark columns of trees. But as I reached it, something made me freeze. On the far side of the clearing, near a stack of rotted branches, the leaves looked disturbed, as if someone had stood there recently. The indentation wasn't large, just the faint outline of a boot, but it was enough to punch the air from my lungs. I scanned the trees, my breaths fogging in front of me, pulse hammering as I waited for movement. No movement, nothing. Just the forest staring back at me, unreadable and still. I sprinted again, bursting into the clearing and fumbling with my truck keys as my fingers shook violently. The metal slipped once, twice, before finally catching. I yanked the door open, threw myself inside, and locked it with a frantic slam of my hand. The engine roared to life, and I tore down the road, gravel kicking up behind me as I took every bend too fast. Branches scraped against the truck's sides like bones dragging across metal, but I didn't slow. I couldn't. My mind was still trapped in that moment, his smile, those names, the sickening certainty that he'd chosen his victims long before they ever saw him. Once I had cell service, hitting 911 felt surreal, like my voice belonged to someone else telling someone else's nightmare. But the deputies didn't doubt me. Their faces drained of color the moment they saw the photos. They recognized names I didn't, hunters missing for years, men whose families never got answers, men who vanished within the same stretch of forest I had walked alone too many times to count. And as they organized search teams and called in federal agents, I felt something colder than fear settle inside me, guilty, because I knew the forest better than most. I should have sensed him sooner, should have left the moment I saw the campsite, should have realized the silence meant something worse than predators or weather. The search lasted weeks. They found more camps, more belongings scattered like discarded memories, shallow graves hidden beneath damp soil, the remains of 3 men, lost to time and the dark, but not him, never him. Every trail camera came back empty. Every footprint vanished into the hollows and ridges like he'd melted into the mountain itself. The investigators told me he was likely a drifter, someone broken by war and isolation, living off stolen supplies and paranoia. But I knew differently. I saw it in his eyes. There was no confusion there, no desperation, only certainty and hunger. For a long time, I tried to convince myself it was over, that he'd moved on, or died, or simply faded into some other forgotten wilderness. I sold my gear. I stopped visiting the land. I avoided even driving near the mountains that once felt like my second home. But some nights, when the wind rose and scraped against the windows just right, I'd swear I heard a familiar rhythm, and it's low, deliberate, patient. The same rhythm as his footsteps in the frost. And every time that sound came, my heart would tighten, because I couldn't shake the feeling that he never left those woods, and I couldn't escape the fear that he still remembered me. As the years passed, the guilt twisted into something heavier, something like dread, mixed with responsibility. I kept wondering, why me? Why did he let me walk away? Was it mercy, or was it something far more horrifying, something intentional? A hunter doesn't chase prey that hasn't run yet. Maybe he wanted me afraid. Maybe he wanted me to remember. Maybe, somewhere in that vast stretch of dark timber and hidden hollows, he carved my name onto a tree too, saving it for later. Now, when sleep refuses to come and the house feels too quiet, I see his smile again, thin, knowing, patient, and I hear the whisper of the forest behind it, the whisper that began everything. He is watching. Would you dare return to this place? The first thing I remember is the way the wind scraped across my tent that morning, like a warning whispered through canvas. I didn't know why it unsettled me so much, but something about that sound felt wrong, like the forest itself was trying to tell me to leave. I'd come out here the same way I had for years, carrying my uncle's old hunting knife and the weight of his memory with me. But as the breeze curled through the trees around my camp, cold and metallic, I felt something tighten in my chest, something I couldn't shake no matter how hard I tried. I'm a paramedic in Charleston, used to chaos, used to people screaming my name for help. Out here, it's the opposite. Silence is supposed to be comforting. Except this time it wasn't. The forest felt emptier than I'd ever seen it, as if the animals had packed up and left in the middle of the night. I tried to ground myself in routine coffee, gear check, the familiar weight of my rifle across my shoulder, but the quiet pressed in like a hand around my throat. Even the colors of the trees seemed too still, too neat, almost posed. I headed up the ridge I'd hunted a dozen times, expecting to see elk moving through the valley, but there was nothing, no birds, no movement, no sound beyond the wind rattling through branches that didn't seem to sway quite right. I tried to brush it off, telling myself the animals were bedded down somewhere deeper, but my stomach kept tightening every time I set my binoculars down and realized the silence hadn't changed at all. Have you ever felt watched even when you absolutely know you're alone? Around noon I took the old logging road along the ridge, the one my uncle always said we'd hike someday. The path felt abandoned, swallowed by undergrowth, but the isolation almost calmed me for a while. The air was cool, my breathing steady. For a moment, I thought maybe the morning had just gotten into my head. Then I saw it, gray wood through the trees, a shape where no shape should be, a cabin, unmarked on any map, old, sagging, nearly swallowed by the forest. Every instinct told me to walk away, but curiosity tugged me forward like a string around my wrist. The closer I got, the colder the air felt, sharp, metallic, like I'd stepped into the shadow of something that shouldn't exist. The cabin door hung half open, creaking gently as though someone had nudged it seconds before I arrived. My boots sank into soft, rotting porch boards as I stepped up and peeked inside. And that's when I felt an immediate pressure in the room, like the air was holding its breath. Inside, everything was neat. A cot, a table, canned food, clothes hung on nails, all arranged as if the owner had just stepped outside to fetch water. But a thin layer of dust covered everything, undisturbed in a way that made my skin crawl. It didn't make sense. It all felt lived in, yet untouched. And beneath it all, that smell, metallic, cold, almost electric. Not rot, not mold. Something sharper, something wrong. I found a journal on the table, old leather pages worn. The first entries were normal elk sightings, weather notes, the exact kind of things I'd write. But halfway through, the tone shifted. The hunter Marcus Holloway wrote about footsteps circling the cabin at night, shadows moving between trees when no wind was blowing, and the sickening feeling of being watched from just beyond the tree line. With every new page, his handwriting fractured into something jagged. He described waking up to his gear moved, or placed deliberately in different corners of the cabin, as if someone wanted him to notice. As the entries grew frantic, dread pulled in my stomach. He tried to leave multiple times but ended up right back at the cabin no matter which direction he walked. He heard voices calling his name, saw symbols carved into trees he swore hadn't been there the day before. And then came the final entry, just 3 sentences. They're outside. I can hear them breathing. I don't think I'm getting out of here. My pulse hammered so hard I could feel it in my throat. I kept sweeping the cabin with my ice-cot shelves, walls, half expecting to see someone crouched behind the door or standing just out of the corner of my vision. The air kept shifting, cold brushing over my neck like fingers. I picked up the journal again, flipping to the inside cover where Marcus had written his name. I whispered it under my breath without realizing why, and that was when I heard it. Footsteps outside, slow, deliberate, crushing dry leaves one by one. I froze, rifle half raised, sweat sliding down my spine as the steps stopped right outside the door. 5 seconds passed, then 10, then 20. Silence, too much silence. I took a breath, barely daring to move, and then behind me a voice whispered my name from inside the cabin. Quiet at first, then louder, stretching through the walls like a breath made of ice. The voice swallowed the room, swallowed me. Then, silence swallowed everything. I don't remember raising my rifle, just the way the cold exploded across the back of my neck as I spun, expecting a face inches from mine. But the cabin was empty. Too empty. The shadows felt thicker now, clinging to the corners like they were waiting to move when I blinked. I backed toward the door, every muscle in my body tight, my breathing sharp and shallow. The voice said my name again, stretching it, bending it, like someone trying to remember how human speech worked. I burst out the door, the porch boards splintering beneath my boots as I sprinted toward the trees. Branches clawed at my jacket. The forest blurred around me. My lungs burned, but I didn't cry, just needed distance. I didn't stop until I couldn't hear the cabin creak anymore. When I finally looked up, gasping, I realized I had no idea where I was. The logging road should have been behind me, but the forest pressed in from all sides, dense and wrong, the trees leaning subtly inward as if listening. I reached for my compass, and my stomach dropped as the needle spun, slowly, steadily, in complete circles. It didn't twitch, didn't hesitate, just rotated endlessly, like it wasn't broken, like it didn't know which way reality was supposed to point. Have you ever felt your sense of direction vanish in a single breath? That animal panic that rises from your spine and makes your heartbeat feel like thunder. That's what hit me. I told myself to stay calm, use the sun, move straight. Don't think about the voice, don't think about Marcus. But every time I stopped and looked around, the trees seemed closer, the underbrush thicker, the light dimmer. I swear at times I saw shapes between the trunks too tall to still vanishing the moment I tried to focus on them. My breathing kept quickening and I forced myself to stop, to ground myself, to think like a paramedic instead of a terrified man losing his grip. I pushed forward for hours. My legs ached, sweat chilled on my back. The sun dipped lower. The shadows stretched longer, bending in unnatural angles as if reaching for my feet. I felt watched closely, watched, the kind of attention that presses onto your skin like a hand covering your mouth. Every snapped twig behind me made my heart jolt. Every rustle made me spin, even though I never saw anything there. Then, as the last sliver of sun slipped behind the ridge, I stepped out of the thick brush, and onto the logging road, the exact spot I'd left it. My knees almost buckled. I stared at the trees around me, my mind scrambling for an explanation, any explanation, but nothing made sense. I should have been miles away. I should have been on another ridge entirely. Instead, I was right back where the nightmare had started. And then, I saw it. The cabin. Old gray sagging door open in a silent invitation. It sat exactly where it had before, as if the forest had guided me back on purpose. I didn't go near it. My whole body rebelled at the thought. I ran down the logging road, the way back toward camp, my pack slamming into my spine with every desperate step. The forest darkened around me. My headlamp flickered against trunks that seemed to shift closer in the edges of the beam, like they were leaning in to watch me pass. By the time I stumbled into my camp, the sky was almost black. My hands shook so violently I could barely collapse my tent. I shoved everything into my pack without caring what I broke or lost. I just needed to get out. I didn't breathe properly until I stepped onto the main trail and started the long hike back to my truck. Except the hike didn't feel long. The forest felt different, compressed every step, echoing like I was walking through a tunnel instead of open woods. The trail twisted in ways I didn't remember. My headlamp flickered again. Shadows lagged behind me, then snapped into place when I turned. My footsteps sounded doubled, like someone or something was matching my pace exactly. I walked faster. The shadow behind me walked faster. I felt breath on my neck that wasn't mine, cold and deliberate, and I didn't dare turn around because some instinct screamed that if I saw it, if I saw whatever was following me, I wouldn't leave those woods alive. I reached the trailhead in 3 hours. That hike should have taken 6. Time didn't feel right. It stretched and collapsed in strange ways. My hands trembled as I opened the truck door. I don't remember driving home. I just remember my heart pounding so hard it made the steering wheel vibrate beneath my fingers. When I finally looked up Marcus Holloway's name, the confirmation felt like ice plunging straight into my chest. He'd vanished from these exact woods. Experienced hunter, no trace, no clues, the same trailhead, the same time of year, the same uncertainty in the eyes of the search crew quoted in news articles. I told the sheriff everything. The cabin, the journal, the voice, the forest that wouldn't let me leave. They said there was no cabin, no structures, nothing that matched my description. So I checked my phone, needing proof that what I saw was real. But the photos were destroyed, blurred beyond recognition, warped as if something had reached into the device and smeared reality with its fingers. The cabin looked like a gray smudge. The journal was unreadable. The symbols on the trees looked melted. And here's the part no one believes. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in bed trying to convince myself it's over, I hear it, that same voice, whispering my name. Not from the hallway. Not from outside, but from the walls. Would you dare return to this place? The first thing I remember from that night is the way the cold air tasted sharp, metallic, almost like the forest was holding its breath and waiting for us to notice. I didn't say anything at first, because growing up in rural Virginia teaches you not to panic at every shift in the wind. But something inside me tightened the moment we stepped into the tree line. Maybe it was instinct, or memory, or something older whispering beneath the soil. I tried to ignore it, because this was supposed to be a good weekend, a reunion, a way to reconnect with friends I hadn't camped with in years. I kept telling myself everything was fine, had to be fine, yet the silence pressing around us felt heavier than our packs. I've been hunting since I was 6, raised by a mother who taught me the forest like it was another language. My brothers and I learned the rhythms of seasons, the way deer sign looks after rain, the difference between a harmless rustle and a predator's stalk. But as we hiked deeper into the hollow, every familiar note felt wrong. Even the creek running beside us sounded muted, its usual chatter dulled like water passing over a closed throat. I tried to shake it off by focusing on my friends, Travis complaining about his pack, Marcus lecturing Jennifer about proper weight distribution, Sarah laughing too loudly. It was normal, human noise. It grounded me. But beneath it, something in the timberline seemed to listen. We reached camp by late afternoon, the hollow cradled between 2 ridges like a cupped hand. I'd camped here since high school. It had always felt safe before. The tents went up quickly. The fire crackled warm, and for a little while the world softened into something peaceful. We cooked, joked, argued about who snores, the loudest normal things people do before the world reminds them how small they are. But sometime around 10, the forest began to dim around the edges, as if the darkness thickened faster than usual. I heard the first twig snap and thought it was a deer, but when the man stepped into the firelight, my throat locked so tight I couldn't force out a breath. He stood just at the edge of shadow, his face carved by a lifetime of weather and worry, his eyes too sharp, too hollow. When he spoke, the flames bent slightly as if they recognized his voice. You need to leave. Tonight. Right now. His tone wasn't threatening, just final, like he was reciting a warning he'd given too many times before. I asked who he was, why we should leave, if something dangerous was out here. He didn't answer a single question. Wouldn't he just kept scanning the tree line as if expecting something to step out behind him? When Marcus challenged him, the old man's voice dropped to something almost broken. I'm not the threat, he whispered. They are, and they don't like strangers in their territory. Then he turned and walked into the darkness. Not away, just into it, and the black swallowed him without sound. We argued, of course, City logic versus forest instinct. Travis brushed it off as some backwoods paranoia. Jennifer said the man was probably drunk or unwell, but I couldn't shake the way his eyes had flicked between the trees like he expected the darkness to breathe. We agreed to stay, but keep watch rotations. When everyone finally crawled into their tents, I sat by the fire with my rifle across my lap, telling myself every hunter gets spooked sometimes. The first hour passed, quietly, owls hooting, creek murmuring, wind sighing through dead leaves. But then, at exactly 1:03 a.m., the forest died. No owls, no wind, no water, just a crushing stillness, like the world had stopped breathing. I lifted my flashlight and swept it across the trees. Nothing, no eyeshine, no movement, just two deep shadows pretending to be empty. Then I heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and many. They circled slowly, just beyond the reach of the firelight, pacing us like a ring closing in. I called out. No response. The footsteps didn't stop, didn't pause, didn't retreat. They just kept circling as if drawing a boundary we weren't meant to cross. When Travis joined me, the sounds stopped instantly. The silence was suffocating. He tried to downplay it, maybe deer, maybe wind, but his voice wavered. The kind of tremor people get when their gut tells them something their brain refuses to admit. I finally retreated to my tent, exhausted but wired, listening for anything, even a breath. That's when Travis's scream shattered the night. We all bolted toward him, flashlights snapping up in frantic sweeps, and there just outside the camp stood, more than a dozen, figures, motionless, silent, watching. Their hoods were pulled low, faces swallowed by shadow, bodies outlined only by the faint glow of dying firelight. They didn't speak, didn't flinch, didn't blink. They just stood there like carved silhouettes carved out of night. Then they moved, every one of them gliding in a wide circle around us without sound. Not one footstep, not one branch cracked. They drifted like darkness, shifting of its own will. Then, silence swallowed everything. The moment the silence hit, something inside me buckled, as if the forest had sealed itself shut around us. Travis raised his rifle, Marcus shouted warnings, and the figures just kept circling. Always at the same distance, never closer, never farther. Their movements were too smooth, too synchronized, like they weren't separate people, but parts of something larger. Each time a beam of light passed over them, their shapes blurred at the edges, as if they didn't fully belong to the world we were standing in. My breath came in short, shallow bursts, the cold air burning like smoke. I kept waiting for one of them to speak, to step forward, to do something, but their silence was the worst part. Silence means confidence. Silence means control. We broke camp fast, hands shaking, gear stuffed randomly into packs. Every zipper sounded painfully loud. Every snapped twig echoed like a warning. The figures tracked us, gliding, drifting, always just out of reach. At one point, Jennifer's flashlight hit one square in the chest, and for a split second I saw something under the hoodskin, too pale, like paper soaked in river water. It vanished the moment she blinked. As we hiked, their movement matched ours perfectly. If we slowed, they slowed. If we stumbled, they paused. It felt like they were herding us, guiding us out, or pushing us deeper in. Halfway out, the forest shifted around us. Paths didn't look right. Fallen logs weren't where I remembered. Even the stars seemed wrong, swallowed by a sky too dark to be natural. My body knew the route I had walked it since childhood, yet the trail felt unfamiliar, twisting in ways it never had. Travis muttered that we were lost, but I wasn't convinced. It felt more like the forest was rearranging itself around us, tilting its bones, trying to see how we reacted. Then the figures vanished, all at once, like they'd stepped backward into a curtain. For a few seconds, relief washed through me so strongly my knees nearly buckled. We quickened our pace, desperate to escape before they returned. But the sudden quiet wasn't a reprieve, it was pressure, a weight, a breath held just beyond the trees. Sarah clutched my arm and whispered, "Do you hear that?" At first I didn't. Then I did, soft clicking sounds like fingernails tapping on bark, following us from tree to tree. Every time I swung my light toward the noise, the tapping instantly stopped. But the moment the beam moved away, it resumed closer every time. Marcus insisted we keep moving. Nobody argued. Our steps became frantic crunches in the leaves, our breaths misting like spirits fleeing our bodies. The tapping grew louder, sharper, then suddenly broke into frantic rustles on both sides of us. A cold wave rolled through my spine so strong I nearly dropped my pack. Something was running parallel to us, fast, too fast. Then the shadows broke. Figures darted between trees, slipping in and out like living cracks in the night. They weren't walking now, they were moving in a way that felt impossible. Bending forward too far, limbs elongating just enough to be wrong. We bolted. Fear made us faster than logic ever could. Travis kept shouting for us to stay together, but all I heard was my heartbeat hammering against bone. When the trucks finally appeared through the trees, the relief was so powerful it felt like a physical collapse. We threw our gear inside and sped off, and I didn't breathe fully until headlights swallowed the access road. At the gas station, under harsh fluorescent lights, reality felt misplaced, too bright, too empty. We checked our phones dead, all of them, batteries full, screens frozen, like something had drained them without touching them. Back home, I couldn't sleep, couldn't stop replaying the shapes, the clicking, the way the forest felt alive, the way it watched. When I finally looked up reports, everything aligned too perfectly. People disappearing, groups chased out, and always the same phrase whispered through old stories from the region, the watchers in the ridge. But the part that still keeps me awake is what my uncle said when I asked him, his voice trembling in a way I'd never heard. They don't just watch the forest, Violet. They watch the people who leave it. I still hear clicking sometimes, late at night, soft rhythmic, coming from the tree line behind my house. And when I look out the window, the shadows seem just a little too tall, and standing just a little too still. If they followed us once, what makes me think they stopped? Would you dare return to this place? The first thing I remember from that October morning was the way the wind scraped across the treetops, almost whispering my name, as if something out there already knew I had arrived. I felt a strange weight in my chest, not fear exactly, but an unease that curled around my ribs and tightened whenever the breeze shifted. I told myself it was just the cold, just nerves from being alone in the woods again after such a long year. My grandfather used to say the forest could sense when a man carried too much in his heart, and maybe that was why everything felt a little sharper, a little too quiet. But I pushed the thought away and stepped deeper into the mountains he had loved more than anything. I had come here to feel close to him, to reconnect with the routines he had taught me, the ones that shaped my entire childhood after my parents died. As I hiked past old stone foundations swallowed by vines, their broken windows staring like empty eye sockets, I felt that familiar mixture of sorrow and gratitude. I breathed in the crisp October air, letting the memory of his laugh drift through me like wood smoke. The trail ahead glowed gold and orange beneath the fallen leaves, stretching deeper toward the forgotten mining town of Thorand. The deeper I went, the more it felt as though the forest was leading me instead of the other way around. When I reached the clearing by the creek, I felt a calm that settled into my bones, warm and steady, the way it used to feel when my grandfather stood beside me on early hunting mornings. I pitched my tent, boiled water, and sat by the fire until the mountains swallowed the last of the daylight. The night wrapped itself around me gently, and for the first time in months, I drifted into a peaceful sleep without waking from nightmares. I didn't know it then, but that would be the last peaceful night I'd have for a very long time. The next morning arrived slow and soft, with sunlight filtering through the canopy and the creek murmuring in the distance. I brewed coffee, packed my day bag, and headed toward the old mine trail I remembered from my teenage years. The forest seemed almost friendly at first, brushing cool air across my face and filling my lungs with the scent of pine and damp earth. The hike took a couple of hours, long enough for the world to stretch out around me until I felt completely alone, swallowed by ridges and hollows that had forgotten human footsteps. But when I finally saw the collapsed mouth of the mine, a shadow passed through me like a hand pressing against my spine. The mine entrance looked darker than I remembered, its broken beams sagging inward like ribs crushed under an unseen weight. I stood there for a long moment, my breath clouding in front of me, trying to imagine the men who once walked into that tunnel every day with only lamps to keep the dark from swallowing them. Rusted rails vanished into blackness, and scraps of metal lay scattered like bones on the forest floor. I was about to turn back when I noticed a narrow trail branching away from the mine, steep and twisted, leading down into a ravine I didn't recall ever exploring. Something about that path tugged at me, subtle at first, then stronger. I stepped closer and noticed the freshly broken branches, the disturbed leaves, the faint drag marks that didn't look like any deer trail I had ever seen. My stomach tightened as I spotted a flash of orange caught on a branch 10 feet ahead. I reached out slowly and pulled it free, feeling my pulse climb when I realized it was part of a hunter's vest, torn down the middle as if something had yanked it violently. I called out, my voice echoing weakly through the ravine, but the silence that followed was so heavy it felt like the forest was holding its breath. I should have turned back, but something pushed me forward, As I descended into the ravine, the canopy grew thicker, muting the daylight until everything took on a dim, bluish haze. The air felt damp and cold, like walking into a basement that had been sealed for decades. I kept following the trail until another piece of fabric appeared on the ground, larger, heavier, stained with something dark that flaked at the edges. My heartbeat echoed in my ears, and every step felt wrong, too quiet, like the forest was absorbing the sound. And then, only 20 feet off the trail, I saw a backpack half buried under a fallen log. The sight of that hunting pack froze me where I stood, because I knew instantly nobody would leave something like that behind willingly. I dragged it out, feeling its surprising weight, and unzipped it with fingers that had started to tremble. Inside were clothes, food, gear, too organized, too untouched. At the bottom I found a plastic-wrapped wallet, holding the ID of a man named Richard Petton, who looked like someone you'd meet at a hardware store on a Sunday morning. Something inside me sank, heavy and cold, and I realized I was standing in the middle of something terrible. I searched the surrounding area and found more items: an open knife on the ground, a smashed GPS like it had been stomped into the dirt, a loaded rifle left leaning against a tree with the safety off. My breath came faster, my throat tightening until it hurt, because nothing about this made sense. Hunters don't abandon gear like that unless they're running, unless they're terrified. I turned slowly, scanning the trees for any movement, and that's when I noticed the scatter of leaves and debris that didn't quite look natural. I knelt and brushed the leaves away, and froze as pale, weathered bones emerged from the dirt. My vision pulsed, my hands went numb. Something in the forest shifted behind me. Then, silence swallowed everything. I stayed kneeling for several seconds, afraid that if I moved too fast, something in the darkness would notice me. The bones were arranged in a way no animal would leave them. Scattered, yet deliberate, like someone had sifted through them for reasons I didn't want to imagine. My breath quickened, each inhale thin and sharp as the cold air sliced down my throat. I tried to stand, but my knees threatened to buckle as shadows stretched across the ravine as though they were moving with intent. Something was wrong with the air, wrong with the ground, wrong with the way the silence pressed against my ears. I forced myself to step back, and that's when I stumbled over the newer bones lying half hidden behind me. The boot beside them was still laced, still intact, but what was inside sat too heavily to be anything other than what I feared. My heart hammered so loudly I thought the entire ravine could hear it as I turned away and tried to steady my breathing. Every instinct screamed to run, to get out before something unseen reached through the trees. But part of me, some stubborn part shaped by years of tracking with my grandfather, kept looking for patterns, for answers. As the wind shifted, the trees groaned softly, and for a moment, I thought I heard something else beneath it, like footsteps, pacing just beyond the tree line. They were slow, rhythmic, deliberate, as if someone or something was matching its breaths with mine. I clamped my teeth together to keep them from chattering and forced myself up the trail, stumbling at first, then walking faster. The forest felt tighter now, the trees leaning inward as though listening to my footsteps. I kept expecting to hear a second set of steps behind me, and maybe I did, or maybe that was just the forest's way of pushing me out. When I reached the mine entrance again, the shadows pooled inside the collapsed tunnel seemed deeper than before, stretching outward as if tasting the daylight. I didn't stop. I didn't even look directly at the darkness. I just kept moving, forcing my legs to climb the mountain trail faster than my breath could catch up. The woods around me felt alive, watching, waiting, learning the rhythm of my retreat. Every dry leaf cracking beneath my boots sounded like a warning, like a countdown I didn't understand. Halfway back to camp, the air shifted again, warmer now, almost stale, as if something massive had just passed through and displaced the cold. The forest fell mute, so quiet my own breathing sounded unnatural. I slowed, scanning the trees, and for a moment I swore I saw a shape tall, crooked, and impossibly still standing between the pines where the light barely reached. My eyes burned as I stared, trying to understand if it was real or just a trick of fear. But before I could focus, the shape dissolved into the shadows, slipping away like smoke in the wind. I stumbled backward, pulse spiking, realizing the forest had never been empty. When I reached my tent, the clearing felt wrong, as if someone had walked through while I was gone. The ground showed no clear prints, but the air was disturbed, carrying a scent like old stone and wet metal. I shoved everything into my pack with shaking hands, barely caring what I crushed or lost. My only thought was getting out, putting as much distance as possible between me and the ravine. The forest watched me leave, branches creaking softly overhead like something whispering goodbye. I nearly ran the entire hike back to my truck, my legs trembling the whole way, breath burning as the cold air scraped through my lungs. Every rustle in the underbrush made my heart slam against my ribs. Every distant crack felt like footsteps closing in. By the time I saw my truck through the trees, relief hit me so hard it almost knocked me off my feet. I threw my gear in the back, jammed the key into the ignition, and sped down the old access road without looking back once. Even when I finally got cell service, the feeling of being watched didn't fade. It clung to me as I called 911, as I drove into the remnants of Thorund, and as I waited for the deputies to arrive. When they asked me to lead them back to the ravine, dread coiled so tightly in my gut I almost said no. But I went because part of me knew I had disturbed something old, something that didn't want to be found, and if the deputies went alone, they might never come back out. When we reached the ravine again, everything was exactly as I'd left it except for one awful detail. The light didn't reach the ground the same way. It was dimmer, heavier, as if the shadows were thickening under our feet. The investigators worked in grim silence, taking photos and collecting remains while I stood near the mine entrance, refusing to go any deeper. Every so often I'd feel a cold draft sliding across my neck, colder than the mountain air, colder than anything natural. Each time I turned, there was nothing there, but I knew something was moving, circling, watching. Over the next 3 days, they recovered 4 sets of remains, some recent, some older than I was. Hunters, hikers, men who had walked these woods decades apart, all vanishing in the same small pocket of forest, all leaving behind gear they never should have abandoned, all dying without struggle, without wounds, without explanation. The investigators were baffled, whispering theories that didn't make sense, theories that avoided the simplest truth. Something in that ravine killed with silence, without leaving marks, without leaving survivors. When they asked me if I had seen anything unusual, I lied and said no. I didn't tell them about the shape in the trees. I didn't tell them about the footsteps that matched my own. I didn't tell them about the cold breath on my neck when I wasn't alone. Because some truths aren't meant to be spoken aloud, not when the forest is still listening. It has been a year, and I still wake in the middle of the night with the taste of wet earth in my mouth. Sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I hear footsteps on my porch, slow, deliberate, matching my breath the way they did in the ravine. I haven't been back to Thrond. I haven't hunted alone since, but some nights when I close my eyes, I feel the mountains calling to me, whispering in a voice that sounds just like my grandfather's. Would you dare return to this place? The first thing I remember from that morning was the way the air felt. Too still, too heavy, like the forest was holding its breath and waiting for something I couldn't name. My father walked ahead of me with that familiar confidence he always carried in the mountains, the kind that made me feel safe even when the dark pressed in from all sides. I followed his footsteps, hearing the soft crunch of leaves beneath my boots and the faint stream whispering somewhere behind us, grounding me in our yearly tradition. But even then, something about the silence felt wrong, not empty, but expectant, as if something unseen was listening. And as the beam of my headlamp flickered across the path, I felt a small tremor of unease pulse through my chest. I grew up in these mountains, North Carolina soil under my shoes, my father's stories stitched into every memory I have of childhood. Turkey season was our ritual, our escape, the one place where he wasn't carrying the weight of bills, broken machinery, or the hospital shifts that drained him. I loved those mornings because they felt timeless, like stepping into a familiar memory every year. But this spring, as we hiked deeper into the forest with the dogwoods blooming ghost-white around us, I sensed something quietly wrong beneath the beauty. And though I tried to ignore it, the feeling clung to me like cold mist. We reached our camp just before dusk, and the world glowed amber as the sun slid behind the ridge. My father practiced his turkey call by the fire, those soft yelps and purrs echoing between the trees, with an oddly hollow resonance, like the woods didn't quite want to answer back. I brewed instant coffee, watching steam rise from the tin cup and swirl into the cooling air, grounding myself in the comforting routine. But when the fire crackled louder than usual, the shadows around us seemed to pull in closer, bending strangely along the jagged bark. I kept glancing toward the tree line, never sure why I expected something to be standing there. The night wrapped around us as we crawled into our tents, and the creek's steady rhythm lulled me towards sleep. I remember thinking everything felt a little too quiet, like the forest was straining to mimic its normal sounds. When my father shook my shoulder at 4:30 a.m., his whisper felt sharper, more urgent than usual, or maybe I was imagining it. We dressed in silence, packed our gear, and headed out toward the ridge where we'd heard the birds. The cold morning air brushed against my face as we walked, each breath forming faint clouds that dissolved into the darkness. My father's sudden stop was so abrupt I nearly walked into him. He lifted one hand, the silent command he'd used since I was 12, and switched off his headlamp. I followed, and the world plunged into blackness so dense it felt like a physical thing pressing against my skin. For several seconds, all I heard was the forest breathing, and then I caught it. Faint voices, low, rhythmic, threading through the trees like some kind of ritual whisper. At first I assumed it was other hunters, but the cadence was wrong, too fluid, too deliberate, rising and falling in patterns that made my stomach tighten. My father leaned close, his breath brushing my ear as he whispered, "You hear that?" When I nodded, I felt him tense, something cold sliding into the space between us. He motioned forward, and despite every instinct screaming at me to turn around, I followed him down the steep slope. The chanting thickened in the air, wrapping around us like a pulse we shouldn't have been able to hear. The hollows around this ridge were steep, tangled with rhododendron so dense it formed natural tunnels. As we pushed through, a faint orange glow shimmered ahead, flickering, alive, moving with the deliberate rhythm of fire. My father motioned low, crouching, and I mirrored him, my heart pounding so loud I worried the forest could hear it. The glow grew stronger as we crept closer, illuminating a clearing carved into a perfect circle amid the trees. And the moment I saw it, a chill shot through me, so cold it felt like stepping into another world. Symbols carved deep and crude spiraled across the trunks surrounding the clearing, each one etched with unsettling precision. There weren't any language I knew, just jagged, interlocking shapes that seemed to bend the firelight unnaturally. 7 large flat stones sat arranged in a perfect ring around the flames, each holding a cloth-wrapped bundle the size of a small child. But there were no people. Not a single footstep, not a single shadow, not even the fading echo of movement. The chanting had stopped the moment we arrived, cut off, clean, like someone flipped a switch. My father whispered that we needed to look, and though fear clawed at my throat, I followed him into the clearing. The fire crackled steadily, burning like it had been fed minutes ago, not abandoned for hours. I positioned myself at the tree line, scanning the woods for any sign of movement as he knelt beside the nearest stone. I heard the slice of his knife cutting through burlap, then a sharp inhale that froze my blood. I turned and saw the small skull staring up at us from within the cut fabric. The tiny bones shone pale in the firelight, arranged neatly as if assembled with unnatural care. My father staggered back, his face gone gray as he whispered, "We need to leave now." I glanced at the other bundles and realized every stone held 7 small forms, 7 silent offerings. The air pressed heavier, the shadows tightening as though the forest itself was watching us. We turned, ready to run, and then silence swallowed everything. We bolted up the ridge as though something unseen chased us, branches scraping my arms like desperate fingers trying to pull me back. My father ran faster than I'd ever seen him, his breath ragged, his boots hammering against the earth with frantic purpose. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see robed figures emerging from the hollow, though nothing ever moved. But the silence behind us felt wrong to complete, too engineered, like the forest was erasing our presence even as we fled. By the time we reached camp, my legs were shaking so hard I nearly collapsed. My father grabbed his satellite phone with trembling hands, his voice low and urgent as he explained everything to the sheriff's office. I paced near the fire ring, trying to calm my breathing, but the woods felt changed around us, like the shadows had grown deeper, heavier, and more watchful. I kept imagining the chanting starting up again in the distance, drifting up the ridge like a warning. But the forest stayed unnervingly still, as if waiting to see what we'd do next. When the deputies finally arrived hours later, I felt a brief surge of relief, but it didn't last long. Leading them back into the hollow was like walking into a memory someone had tampered with. The clearing was there, the tree carvings untouched, the stones arranged exactly as before, but the fire was cold, dead ashes scattered by wind that hadn't existed earlier, and every bundle had vanished without a trace. No footprints, no drag marks, not even the faint scent of smoke. The detective's frown deepened, but I could tell he didn't believe what we'd seen. My father argued, desperate, insisting the remains were real, that we'd seen them minutes before calling. The detective nodded with polite skepticism, jotting notes as if humoring a pair of frightened hikers. Deputies combed the entire hollow, searching for disturbed soil, fresh cuts on trees, scattered cloth, anything to prove we weren't imagining things. But the forest gave them nothing. It was as if someone had known we were coming and cleaned every trace before dawn. When we left with the deputies, the sun was high and hot, but the warmth didn't touch me. I felt hollowed out, weighed down by the certainty that we had stumbled into something far older and more organized than a random ritual site. On the drive home, my father's hand stayed locked around the steering wheel, knuckles white, jaw clenched as though he could hold back the fear through sheer strength. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words stuck in my throat. The image of that small skull burned too vividly in my mind. Back home, I hunted for answers with an obsession that bordered on desperation. Old reports, forum posts, archived newspaper clippings, all of them whispering the same story in different voices. Strange symbols, stone circles, disappearances, cleaned up sites authorities could never confirm. It felt like a pattern hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to look close enough to see the shape beneath it. When we met with the detective again, I expected dismissal, but instead he closed the file slowly, leaning back with a look I had never seen before. He told us there were old cases from the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, all describing things eerily similar to what we'd found. Cases that never led anywhere because evidence disappeared. Sites that were reported, then vanished when law enforcement arrived. And older deputies who whispered theories about a group that knew those mountains better than anyone else alive. I felt something cold slide down my spine, not fear, but recognition. If they knew the terrain better than anyone, then they also knew we were there. They knew we saw them, and they knew we ran. My father cancelled our trips. He stopped talking about the mountains altogether, as if avoiding the memories might keep whatever we'd seen from finding us. But at night, sometimes I'd catch him staring out the window toward the dark line of trees beyond our yard, eyes distant, haunted, and sometimes I'd hear a faint rhythm in the distance, a soft rise and fall like far-off chanting, and every time, I'd freeze, wondering if it was real, or if the forest had followed us home. I still don't know what that circle meant, or why the bundles vanished, or who or what was chanting in the dark. I only know this: some things in those mountains are older than any of us, and smarter, and patient enough to wait decades between sightings. And I know they aren't gone, they're watching. They're always watching. And if we had stayed in that clearing just a few minutes longer, we wouldn't be telling this story at all. Would you dare return to that place? The first sign that something was wrong was the way the forest swallowed our voices that afternoon, as if the trees were holding their breath and waiting. I didn't think much of it at the time, but there was a pressure in the air, a heaviness that settled on my shoulders the moment Derek disappeared up the eastern ridge. I stood there for a moment longer than I should have, staring at the spot he vanished into the rhododendron thickets, feeling an unease crawl under my skin even though I tried to ignore it. This was supposed to be our yearly escape, our reset. Yet as the silence grew around me, it felt like the woods were listening. I turned toward the western ridge, forcing myself to focus on the hunt and not the lingering chill biting at the back of my neck as I climbed the slope. The afternoon light filtered through the trees and fractured beams, catching dust motes and drifting leaves in a way that almost felt staged, as if the forest was presenting itself to me. Everything looked familiar, from the scouting trip's bare tracks, pressed deep into soft earth, overturned logs, claw marks carved into smooth bark. But there was something extra, something I couldn't name. Even the wind felt wrong, brushing past me in brief, deliberate strokes like fingers testing my reaction. Every so often I paused, holding my breath and listening, wondering why my heartbeat sounded louder than it should. I followed a game trail for over an hour, marking fresh sign and trying to settle back into the rhythm I'd known since childhood. I thought of Derek, his loud laugh, the stories he told about the woman in Pittsburgh, the way he always said he felt more himself in the woods than anywhere else. It made me smile, just for a moment, before the forest answered my thoughts with a strange echo, a faint creak or groan that traveled through the branches above me. I couldn't tell if it was natural. I didn't like that. I had to wonder. As the shadows stretched across the ridge, I decided to head back early and surprise him with a fire waiting. By the time I reached camp at 5:15, the air felt colder than it should have, like the mountains had exhaled and left frost in their wake. I built the fire, watched the flames catch and climb, and let the familiar crackle calm me. But the longer I sat waiting, the more the silence pressed in, thick and expectant. At 5:30 I told myself he was just running late. At 6 o'clock I told myself nothing was wrong. At 6:15, with the sun bleeding out behind the ridges and the shadows swallowing the creek bed, I stopped pretending. I grabbed my rifle and my headlamp and crossed the water, calling Derek's name into a forest that refused to answer. As I climbed the eastern ridge, my voice bounced back to me in strange ways, like the echo didn't know how to mimic my tone correctly. My beam shook across the undergrowth, catching glimpses of movement that always disappeared before I blinked. I kept calling his name, the sound thinning into the wind as if something was stealing pieces of it before it reached the treetops. By the time I reached the top, night had taken the woods completely. The forest felt too still, too poised, as if every tree was leaning in to listen. When I found the fresh bear tracks on the trail, my stomach knotted itself tight. Derek knew how to handle wildlife, but the sight of those deep prints, heading the same direction he had gone, made something inside me sink. I tried to stay calm as I followed the ridge, but the quiet felt unnatural. No insects, no birds, no rustling brush. My footsteps sounded intrusively loud, as if the forest wanted to chastise me for making noise. And then I spotted the gleam of metal in my light Derek's rifle leaning against a tree, perfectly upright, untouched, the safety off, the barrel clean. It looked placed, not dropped. My breath seized in my throat as I reached for it, feeling the cold metal bite into my palm like a warning. Derek would never set his rifle down, never. Panic crawled up my spine as I found his backpack 30 feet away, lying untouched on the forest floor like an abandoned offering. Everything was inside, nothing disturbed. His GPS track ended exactly where I stood, as if he had simply vanished into the air. I called his name again, my voice cracking in a way I couldn't control, and that's when I heard Ita scream, distant and sharp, echoing through the hollow beyond the ridge. It was Derek. I knew that voice better than my own heartbeat. I ran. I didn't think, I just ran into the darkness, my headlamp slicing through trees and shadows that felt like they were shifting out of my way. As the scream came again louder, closer, it twisted, in a strange way, the pitch bending just slightly wrong, too stretched, too deliberate, like someone imitating a human cry but not understanding how fear really sounds. I froze. The forest held its breath, and in that breathless silence, the scream moved. Then silence swallowed everything. For a moment I couldn't tell if my heart was still beating or if the forest had stolen that too. The quiet pressed against my ears so tightly I almost wished for another scream. Almost. Then it came again, but this time behind me, the sound sharp enough to cut through bone. I spun around, my light shaking violently, trying to find the source, but there was nothing except trees swaying slightly, as if something enormous had just slipped between them. My voice cracked as I called Derek's name again, but the forest seemed to swallow it whole before it reached the next ridge. I forced myself to breathe and checked my GPS, but my hands were trembling so badly that I could barely hold it steady. The screen flickered, glitched, then froze. That had never happened before, and the timing felt intentional. Another scream tore through the night, this time to my left, then to my right, then directly ahead of me. Each time the tone shifted, mimicking Derek so well that it made my stomach twist, but always just imperfect enough to let me know it wasn't really him. Does that make sense? Have you ever heard something pretend to be human and almost succeed? I stepped backward, then forward, then turned in a panicked circle as echoes spun around me like a predator herding prey. Every direction looked the same: dark trunks, tangled brush, gaps where shadows moved against the wind. My light skittered across the ground, and for a moment I thought I saw footprints deep wide and far apart. Not Derek's, not a bear's. Something else, something heavy. The scream cut through the forest again, but this time it was warped, stretched longer than lungs should allow. It felt like the forest was grinning. I tried to tell myself to stay calm, but the sensation of being watched crawled over my skin like cold water. Then came the footsteps, slow, heavy, deliberate. Branches snapped under its weight, moving closer with each breath I took. I raised my rifle and aimed into the darkness, but the beam hit nothing except shifting shadows. The footsteps grew louder 20 yards, 15-10 end. Then they stopped just outside the reach of my light, as if whatever it was understood exactly how far I could see. My throat tightened painfully as I whispered Derek's name again, but even I could hear the tremor of dread inside it. Something moved just beyond the lighter shape or a breath or the subtle ripple of leaves. I felt it watching me. Not with eyes, but with intention. A deep, ancient focus that made my bones feel too small for my body. I don't know how long I stood like that. Maybe minutes, maybe a lifetime. The forest waited with me, as if holding a final note of tension before something horrible played out. I began backing away, keeping my rifle trained on the darkness. Every step felt like it might be my last. The moment I turned and ran, the woods exploded around me in chaotic whispers, branches snapping, footsteps pacing me just out of sight, and somewhere far too close, a low, breathy imitation of my own voice calling my name. I ran harder, lungs burning, vision swimming, until the forest opened up and my camp came into view, flickering weakly under the moonlight. I stumbled into the clearing like an animal escaping a snare. I collapsed near the fire, shaking uncontrollably, watching the tree line for any sign of movement. The forest felt alive, pulsing with something ancient and hungry. When I finally grabbed the satellite phone, my fingers were so numb I could barely dial. My voice cracked as I reported Derek missing, trying not to sound insane. I didn't sleep that night, couldn't, because the woods whispered just beyond the fire's glow, branches shifting in ways that didn't match the wind. Every time the fire popped, I flinched, expecting something to step into the clearing. At sunrise, the forest looked harmless again, quiet, innocent, but I felt eyes on me the entire hike back to the road. When the search teams arrived, I kept waiting for the forest to reveal what it had shown me the night before, but it stayed silent, mocking me. For 5 days they searched, using dogs, drones, and helicopters. The dogs refused to track near the ridge. The handlers said it was unusual. I knew better. I could still feel the weight of whatever had stood just outside my life. When they found Derek on day 4, 3 miles away, curled in a hollow like a discarded doll, I felt the blood drain from my body. He was alive, but the moment I saw his eyes, I knew he had not escaped that thing. His pupils were blown wide, unfocused, hollowed out like the woods had scraped something out of him during the ambulance ride. He stared ahead without blinking, as if afraid to look at the trees passing by the windows. When he finally spoke days later, his voice sounded wrong, flatter, thinner, like something had been stretched inside him. He claimed he remembered nothing, but his eyes told the truth. Something had followed him. Something had copied him. Something had screamed with his voice. Even now, months later, Derek refuses to talk about it. He avoids forests, avoids phone calls, avoids me. Sometimes, late at night, I replay the moment I heard his scream shift right behind me, and I wonder if the thing in the woods had been practicing his voice long before I heard it. Sometimes I swear I hear it outside my house, soft, almost playful, imitating him just slightly wrong. And sometimes, when the night is too quiet, I think about that clearing on the ridge and the way the forest held its breath before it screamed through him. Whatever followed Derek out of those mountains, it's not finished. Would you dare return to this place? The first thing I remember is the sound, soft, rhythmic, almost like breathing, but carried on the cold morning air in a way that made my skin prickle before my mind even woke up. I was sitting on the damp forest floor with my camera already raised, the lens fogging at the edges as the first hints of sunrise slid between the branches. I should have felt calm out there, wrapped in the familiar routine of opening day, but something in the wind felt wrong, like it hesitated before touching me. Maybe that's why my heartbeat felt louder than the shutter clicks, heavier than it should have been for a simple morning hunt. Earl had invited me because he said the ridge was special, a family tradition spot with good deer, clear lines of sight, and quiet so deep it made the world feel paused. I'd never hunted before, so I focused on taking photos instead, capturing the soft glow on the tree bark, the frost catching in Kaylee's hair, the way the old rifles looked almost sentimental against the rising light. We were spread out in a neat formation, silent, patient, breathing in sync with the woods. It felt peaceful then, grounded and real, until a faint snapping sound echoed from somewhere beyond the ridge, too sharp and quick, too deliberate to be an animal stepping on a twig by accident. At first I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just a squirrel or maybe a fox weaving through the leaves. But the second snap came faster, like something repeating itself with purpose. I lowered my camera and scanned the trees, noticing how the shadows seemed longer than they should have been for dawn, stretching at odd angles as if pulled by invisible strings. The calm I felt earlier began to crumble, piece by piece, replaced by a quiet shiver crawling up my spine, and when the buck walked out, a big, healthy one with a thick winter coat, it felt like a small blessing, a grounding reminder of why we were all there. But the woods behind it were wrong, too still, too expectant. I lifted my camera again, letting the shutter go wild as the buck fed on acorns without a care in the world. The morning light made the scene almost beautiful, turning the mist pale gold around its antlers, but then something flickered behind it. Not moved, flickered, like a glitch, a jump, a smear of motion that didn't make sense. I squinted, breath trapped in my throat, and the lens sharpened on a figure stepping out from the trees. A man, tall, naked, skin the color of ash. His head was tilted just slightly, like he was listening for something only he could hear, and for a second I thought he was just injured or lost. But then he moved, and every thought I had about logic vanished. He didn't walk, he didn't run. He shifted closer, then closer again, like someone was dragging him through space, one frame at a time. My camera kept firing even though my finger felt frozen, locked in place by fear I didn't know I could feel. The buck never reacted, never sensed him, never lifted its head, even as the figure closed the distance in those impossible, silent flickers. My stomach twisted so hard I nearly dropped the camera when he crouched low behind the deer, knees bending backward in a sickening angle that made bile rise in my throat. Then he lifted his head and stared straight into the lens, and everything inside me stopped. Those eyes, solid, black, reflective, empty, felt like falling into a well with no bottom. His lipless, too wide smile stretched across his face like skin pulled too tight, and for a moment the camera felt like a thin shield between us, useless and fragile. The deer bolted without warning, bursting into motion as if suddenly waking from a trance, and before the dust even settled, the figure was gone, not running, not leaping, just gone, erased, deleted. The space behind the trees looked untouched, the air undisturbed, as if he had never existed at all. The panic didn't hit me all at once. It built slowly, rising from the pit of my stomach until my hands shook so hard I felt the camera rattling against my chest. I looked up at Erla's face, pale, his mouth open, his eyes locked on the empty space the creature had been. When he climbed down from the stand, he moved with a speed and urgency that didn't belong to a 70-year-old man. And when he reached me, he grabbed my arm hard enough to hurt. His whisper wasn't soft at all. It was sharp and trembling and terrified in a way that made my knees nearly buckle. "We're leaving now." We didn't pack gently. We didn't whisper. We barreled through the brush like something was chasing us. And even though I never turned around, I swear the woods felt like they were watching us leave. When we reached the meeting point, everyone else was already there, pale and trembling, eyes wide in that same hollow dread. Kaylee was crying silently, her father clutching her against his chest as if the trees themselves might reach out and take her. They had all seen something, some shape, some flicker moving through the woods too fast to be human. Earl wouldn't let anyone speak until we were in the trucks with the doors locked. Only then did he tell us what his grandfather had told him, the old story about the North Ridge and the things that lived there. He called them runners, things that slipped between the trees at dawn, things that didn't hunt deer but fed on what lived inside the deer, things that remembered anyone who saw them. His final words hung in the air like smoke. "If one looks you in the eye, you have 1 year." As the truck rumbled to life and the ridge disappeared behind us. Then silence swallowed everything. The days after the hunt felt strange, like something had settled into the corners of my vision that didn't belong there. The photos sat on my memory cards untouched for nearly a week, because every time I thought about going through them, my chest tightened and a cold pressure slid down my spine. At night, when I lay in bed, I'd catch myself listening for footsteps outside, slow ones, fast ones, anything that matched the unnatural rhythm I'd seen in the woods. The house felt smaller than usual, the shadows deeper, the air heavier, as if it carried a memory I couldn't shake loose. When I finally loaded the photos onto my computer, I told myself it was just to prove I was overreacting, that maybe my mind had twisted something frightening into something impossible. The folder opened with a soft click, and for a few minutes I felt almost relieved. Shots of the family smiling, the ridge glowing at sunrise, the deer wandering lazily through the trees, everything ordinary, everything safe. But then the timestamp, 7 hours, 18 minutes and 42 seconds, caught my eye, and the relief curdled instantly. There were 37 frames in that burst sequence, each one taken mere fractions of a second apart, each one pulling me back into that moment whether I wanted it or not. In the first frame, the figure was distant, barely visible between the trees, like a trick of light or a shadow misplaced. In the next, he was closer, and closer, and closer and closer, each frame showing a movement that defied physics, transition, logic. He wasn't walking, he was appearing, flickering, jump-cutting across reality like someone was dragging him toward me. I swallowed hard, leaning closer to the screen, unable to tear my eyes away even though every instinct screamed at me to stop. And then I reached the final frame, 7 hours, 18 minutes and 45 seconds, and froze completely. He filled the entire shot, face stretched far too wide, eyes huge and black and wet-looking, reflecting the morning light in a way that made my stomach churn. His mouth was open in a shape that wasn't a scream or a smile, but something between. Something wrong, as if the face didn't understand what expression was supposed to look like on a human skull. I zoomed in slowly, my breath trapped tight in my chest, and the closer I got, the worse it felt, because in the reflection of those bottomless black eyes, I could see myself, my own face twisted in terror, my own mouth open in a scream I didn't remember making. My hands shook so violently I had to steady them against the desk, and for a moment I thought about deleting everything: photos, backups, the whole drive. But something held me back. Curiosity, fear, denial. I still don't know. What I do know is that I called Earl the next day, hoping his familiar voice might ground me, might make the story less monstrous. Instead, his son answered, voice heavy and tired. Earl had died in his sleep exactly 1 year after the hunt. Heart attack, they said. Peaceful, natural. But nothing about that timing felt natural at all. After that, I stopped trying to rationalize anything. I stopped going out at dawn. I closed my blinds at sunset. I locked my doors in the afternoon, before the shadows stretched across the floor. But paranoia works like water, it finds every crack soon. I found myself turning off reflective surfaces, because sometimes, just for a split second, I thought I saw something behind me. Something tall, something pale, something flickering at the edges like a corrupted file. And every time November crept closer, I felt it tooth await. The pressure, the unseen presence pacing just beyond the walls of my home. As the second year approached, my routines changed completely. I worked from home. I avoided windows. I stopped answering calls after dark. Sometimes at night I'd hear faint footsteps outside, fast ones, impossibly fast, circling the house in stuttering bursts of motion. The air would grow colder then, chilling me through the walls, and sometimes I'd hear a soft tapping on the glass, not knocking, not scratching, tapping, like someone impatient, someone who could move faster than sound. Someone remembering I had once seen them clearly. I started sleeping with headphones on, drowning out every noise with white static, but even then I'd feel the same prickle beneath my skin, the same tension in the air that I had felt on the ridge. It was as if the world around me had begun to glitch the same way the figure had, shadows freezing for a heartbeat, reflections bending slightly, lights flickering in patterns too regular to be random. Sometimes I'd catch myself staring at the hallway, expecting something to flicker into existence at the far end. Tall and pale and watching. I know what you're wondering: why not move? Why not leave the country? Why not run? But here's the thing. You can't outrun something faster than motion itself. Something that moves in frames, not steps. Now, as I count down the days to the next November, the dread feels different, closer, heavier, almost curious. Sometimes, when the wind drags against the siding at night, it sounds like breathing again. And sometimes I swear I hear the faint clicks of a camera shutter, echoing faintly in the dark, as if something out there remembers exactly how I looked at the moment I saw it. Maybe the 1-year rule doesn't apply to photographers. Maybe it does. Maybe I'll find out when the first light of opening morning touches the ridge again. Would you dare return to this place, if you knew something still remembered your face? The first time I felt something was wrong was the moment I stepped into that clearing, because the air didn't move like it normally did. It pressed against me, warm and slow, as if breathing against my skin. I'd been hunting these mountains for years, and I knew every ridge and hollow the way some men know the lines on their palms. But that morning, as I walked toward the basin I'd scouted a dozen times, my stomach tightened for no reason I could name, like some part of me already understood what waited ahead. And when the trees opened around me and I saw it standing there, a massive white oak that had absolutely not existed the season before, my breath caught so sharply it felt like someone had hooked my ribs. I whispered out loud, that wasn't here. Yesterday. I don't scare easily, not out there anyway. Not in the place I always called my church, but that tree made the world feel unfamiliar, as if I'd stepped into a memory someone else had written. The oak towered over the clearing, its bark pale and strangely smooth, branches stretching upward in a perfect symmetry that didn't look natural. I'd glassed this spot from the ridge 100 times. It had been nothing but young poplar and laurel, maybe 8 feet tall at most. No gaps, no space, no ancient tree dominating the skyline. Standing before it now, I felt the same slow disbelief you feel when recognizing a face in a place it shouldn't be. Except this face was 30 feet wide. I circled the tree in silence, my boots barely making a sound on the soft autumn ground. And the strangest detail was the ground itself, untouched, undisturbed, as if the clearing had been here long before I was born. Fresh growth around the edges, tall grass bending with the breeze, no stump holes, no broken earth. I should have backed out and called the forestry service, but instead I reached out and placed my hand on the bark. The heat that pulsed beneath it wasn't the sun, it was thicker, closer, a slow rhythmic throb that crawled up my arm like a heartbeat. For a long moment I stood frozen, my breath held tight in my chest as if the tree were listening. That night I barely slept, but by dawn the hunter in me had overpowered the unease, pushing everything strange into a corner of my mind where discomfort becomes curiosity. I returned with a tree stand strapped to my pack and forced myself not to think about how bizarre it was to trust something that breathed. The trunk accepted the straps without resistance, almost like the bark softened where the metal bit in. I told myself it was just good luck, just a healthy tree, just my imagination twisting things that didn't matter. But when I climbed up and settled in, the forest around me felt attentive, as if waiting for me to do something worth noticing. And when the deer started arriving, slow and dazed, walking with an odd heaviness, I finally exhaled. By the third evening I shot a 10-point buck that should have been impossible to pattern in public land that size, and yet the animals kept coming, hour after hour, all walking the same path toward the oak as if guided by something I couldn't see. None of them looked up at me, not once, even though deer always check the wind. Their heads stayed low, their eyes half-lidded, and sometimes they stumbled like they were exhausted or drugged. It felt wrong, but success has a way of muting instinct. I told myself it was coincidence, that the tree was just in a perfect funnel, that the deer were pressured elsewhere, and I pretended not to notice the way the air around me felt thick and humid even when the temperature dropped. On the 7th night everything shifted. I climbed down at last light, boots hitting the ground softly, and when I turned back toward the oak, my chest tightened. Every branch I had trimmed for shooting lanes, branches I had cut clean with a saw, had grown back, not slowly, not subtly, but fully, with thick green leaves that shouldn't have existed in October. My breath trembled as I stepped closer, because the leaves weren't just fresh, they were wet, glistening with dew as if the tree itself had sweated them out and carved into the bark. Sap still bleeding in thin amber lines, were 5 words written in handwriting that matched mine exactly. Levi, you are not supposed to stay after dark. My legs went cold, my throat tightened, my fingers brushed the carving, and the tree pulsed beneath my skin, a long slow inhale that made the ground shift with it. I stepped back, arrow nocked, breath shaking hard enough that I could feel it echo in my teeth. The forest around me had gone absolutely still, no insects, no wind, no rustling leaves, just silence pressing down so violently it felt like standing inside a sealed room. Then, silence swallowed everything. The moment that silence hit, the forest seemed to fold inward, crushing the space around me until every sound felt trapped inside my skull. I backed away with slow steps, trying not to break a twig, but the pressure in the air made movement feel heavy, almost underwater. The oak's trunk expanded and contracted in a steady rhythm, a long, unsettling breath that made the clearing sway slightly as if the world tilted with it. I wanted to run, but my knees shook so badly I had to force myself to turn without sprinting. And when I finally did move, the leaves overhead shifted in a deep, low exhale like the tree noticed. As the night deepened, the shadows along the ground stretched out behind me, reaching farther than they should have, bending unnaturally across the clearing. Every few steps the breathing behind me grew louder, slow at first, then sharper, as if something enormous had woken up. My lungs tightened with each inhale, my heart beat pounding against my ribs so violently I worried the tree could hear it. I didn't dare look back. Sometimes fear builds slowly, but this wasn't that. This was the kind that snaps your instincts into raw survival. And then something cracked in the woods to my right, just once, like a bone underweight. I froze. The sound wasn't an animal, it wasn't a branch, it was deliberate. Like whatever lived inside that oak had stepped outside its skin. My breath stuttered as I stood there, shoulders tense, trying to decide whether to bolt or stay perfectly still. A faint warmth brushed the back of my neck, subtle, then stronger, the same heat I'd felt earlier when touching the bark. But there was no breeze, no reason for warmth to be there, and that meant only one thing: something was behind me. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and whispered a single shaky question to myself. How close is it? The breathing grew louder, right at my back, steady and slow, like a massive lung expanding inches from my spine. I stepped forward once, then again, and then the breathing stopped entirely, cut off mid-inhale, which somehow felt worse, because silence meant it was waiting. I braced myself, expecting to be grabbed or dragged or worse, but nothing touched me. Instead, a whisper drifted from the direction of the oak, thin and broken, the sound of bark splitting under pressure. Levi's. The voice wasn't mine, but it knew mine, and the familiarity in it sliced straight through my chest. That was the moment I ran. Not smart, controlled, running full panic, crashing through brush, branches whipping my face as I sprinted up the ridge. Behind me, something moved fast, faster than I thought possible, heavy steps tearing through the clearing in a rhythm that matched the oak's earlier pulse. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Every instinct screamed to get to the logging road, to get to open space, to put anything between me and that impossible tree. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped abruptly, a dead halt, and the sudden silence nearly made me fall forward onto my hands. I listened, chest heaving, waiting for it to move again. Nothing. No footsteps, no breathing, just the distant hum of wind, faint but real, like the world had finally remembered how to exist. I forced myself forward, stumbling until the woods opened onto the gravel road, moonlight brushing over my shaking hands. I didn't stop at my truck door. I didn't look back at the trailhead. I didn't breathe until the tires hit pavement, and even then, the scent of fresh-cut oak followed me home like it had been caught on my clothes. For a month, I avoided that entire mountain range. I told myself the clearing had been some kind of hallucination, some stress-induced trick, something rational if I looked at it from the right angle. But the nightmares didn't stop. Dreams of branches growing into my arms, of bark forming over my mouth, of being rooted to the ground while something breathed through me. Eventually, curiosity overpowered fear, like it always does for hunters who think they understand the woods. I drove back to the pull-off one cold afternoon, telling myself I wasn't going to walk and just glance uphill. But the clearing was gone, vanished. No open space, no sunlight breaking through, just thick second-growth poplar and laurel, exactly as it had been before that oak ever existed. I stood there for a long time, breath shaking, replaying every step I had taken, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what I knew had happened. My tree stand was still up there somewhere, but now it hung on a tree that no longer existed. A tree that had breathed, a tree that had spoken my name, a tree that somehow wrote warnings in my handwriting. That night, the wind shifted from the northwest. I woke at 3 a.m., heart pounding before I even understood why. The room cold except for a single warm draft slipping through my open window. The scent hit me first. Sharp, sweet, fresh-cut white oak, drifting across the room in a way impossible for November. And beneath the smell, pulsing through the night air, came that familiar, slow, rhythmic sound. The inhale, the exhale, the living, breathing heartbeat of something that had followed me home. And now, every time the wind shifts, I hear it again, waiting outside, patient, rooted in a place that shouldn't exist anymore. Sometimes the breathing comes from the yard, sometimes from the woods behind my house, and once, just once, it came from directly beneath the floorboards. So I'm asking you, if something ancient can move without moving, can appear where it never grew, can write warnings it expects you to obey, what happens when you fail to listen? Would you dare return to this place? I felt the first spike of unease the moment the wind brushed across the ridge, carrying a faint humming that didn't belong in the wilderness, a thin, almost childlike tune that tugged at some buried memory I didn't want to revisit. Not out here, not alone. I had come to the North Cumberland Wildlife Management Area for silence, for 7 full days of isolation, for the kind of stillness that lets a man reset his mind. I was 33, a lifelong hunter, and solitude had always been my sanctuary. Nothing but the ridges, the fog, and the endless reclaimed mineland, stretching for miles. I had camped high above an old strip bench, protected from the wind but surrounded by valleys deep enough to swallow echoes. For 5 days everything felt normal. Cold mornings, long hikes, elk sign just fresh enough to keep my hopes alive. By the 6th dawn the ridge was buried in low-hanging mist, thicker than anything I had seen all week, the kind that dulls sound and makes distance impossible to judge. I had started down an abandoned haul road, scanning the laurel thickets for movement, trying to catch the bull I'd been tracking, the one with the broken tine, the ghost everyone in town talked about. My boots crushed frost-coated gravel, each crunch too loud in the muted air, each breath hanging in front of me like smoke. Then the humming sharpened into words, soft and floating, familiar in a way that punched straight into my chest. It was "I'll Fly Away," the hymn my grandmother sang every Sunday morning, the one she whispered when she tucked me in at night. I froze because the voice wasn't just singing, it was clear, steady, and unmistakably young, a little girl's tone echoing from somewhere down the slope. I told myself it had to be campers, maybe a family hiking early, maybe someone let their kid wander too far into the fog. But something felt wrong about how smooth the singing was, like it wasn't coming from lungs at all, just drifting without breaks for breath. Against my better judgment, I stepped off the haul road and followed the sound down the side ridge, brushing past wet branches and patches of blackberry bramble. The melody never changed pitch, never cracked, never paused. It just pulled me deeper, like a thread tied around my ribs. When I reached the meadow, the fog thinned just enough to reveal her, a barefoot little girl in a dirty white dress that looked decades old, her blonde hair falling clear to her waist. She stood among the blackberry bushes, plucking berries one by one with a slow, practiced motion as if nothing around her existed. For a second, I convinced myself she was real, flesh and blood, just a lost kid who wandered too far. I called out gently, trying not to scare her, asking if she was lost, if I could help her find her parents. She turned to me with a smile that was too knowing, too calm, too still, and then she spoke my name. The air drained out of me so fast it felt like someone punched a hole in my chest because I hadn't told a single soul I was out here, not my friends, not my coworkers, not even my family. Only the TWRA officer who checked my permit knew, and he sure as hell hadn't whispered my name to a child wandering barefoot in reclaimed mining land. She kept smiling like she'd always known I'd show up here, like she'd been waiting for me since before the ridge had a name. Then she mentioned the bull, my bull, the one with the broken tine, and told me exactly where he was bedded down. But she followed it with a warning so strange and cold it felt like ice cracking along my spine. She said I shouldn't go to the spring because Mama's waiting, and she's hungry. The words rolled out of her like a recited line, something drilled into her long before I was even born. I lifted my rifle a little, not pointing it, just needing something solid between us, something real. I asked where her parents were, trying to keep my voice steady even though my heartbeat sounded like footsteps behind me. She tilted her head with that same unnatural smile and whispered, "Same place yours are." Something in me snapped, instinct, fear, maybe the leftover wisdom of every hunter who'd ever survived the mountains. I watched her walk backward into the fog, still singing, her feet hovering just above the grass, never bending a blade. The mist swallowed her whole as the hymn faded into nothing, leaving the meadow too silent to feel natural. I turned, every nerve screaming at me to move, and began the fastest hike of my life back up the ridge. My pack was thrown together in minutes, hands shaking, breath raw, heart refusing to steady no matter how far I got from that meadow. Then, silence swallowed everything. As I pushed away from the ridge, the fog thickened again, swallowing the trees until only their silhouettes remained, stretched thin like skeletal frames. My footsteps sounded wrong, too soft, too muted, as if the ground beneath me was absorbing every sound I made. I didn't dare look over my shoulder because every part of me felt watched, followed, trailed by something light-footed and patient. The hymn kept replaying in my head, each verse twisting tighter, taking on tones that felt older than memory, older than the ridge itself. I kept moving, forcing myself not to run. The trail dissolved into a blur beneath my boots, and the 8 miles back to the truck felt like walking through a tunnel with no end. Shadows shifted between the trees, pausing when I paused, sliding when I slid, mimicking my breath as though mocking the rhythm of my fear. Several times I thought I heard soft humming behind me, not singing now, just a long, breathless hum rising and falling like someone floating just out of sight. Every time I stopped, it stopped. Every time I hurried, it returned. The moment I reached my truck, the air seemed to loosen, almost as if whatever trailed me couldn't cross the gravel lot. My hands trembled so violently I fumbled the keys twice before I finally managed to shove them into the ignition. As the engine turned over, I looked into the tree line one last time, expecting those small pale feet to be hovering above the ground. But the forest remained still, fog hanging like curtains, hiding something that preferred to watch rather than follow. I drove until the fog disappeared behind me completely. Back home, the quiet felt foreign, too easy, too normal, too safe, as if the stillness was pretending. I couldn't shake the girl's face, or the way she smiled like she had known me long before I ever walked those ridges. Sleep wouldn't come, not for nights, and when it finally did, I woke up drenched in sweat, hearing that hymn echoing in the corners of my bedroom. Something about her name tugged at me, pulling me into research videos, scanned newspaper archives, and old missing person databases. After 2 weeks of searching, I found her. Abigail Crawford, missing since 1938, last seen picking blackberries with her mother near the same mountain that later became North Cumberland WMA. Her mother was discovered wandering an old haul road, naked and covered in blood, babbling about the hungry woman in the laurel. They locked her away until she hanged herself in 1941. Abigail's body was never found. The more I read, the colder the room felt. I tried telling myself she couldn't be real, that I'd misheard, misremembered, imagined the way she hovered above the grass. But then a game camera photo surfaced online posted by a hunter 3 ridges over, taken 2 weeks after I left. It showed the massive bull I'd been tracking, standing in the very meadow where I saw Abigail, and beside his hooves was a single barefoot footprint, small, perfect, pressed deep into the mud where no child should have been. I stared at that footprint for nearly an hour. Ever since then, something has shifted around me, tiny details, barely there, but enough to unsettle. My house creaks in places it never used to. Doors I'm certain I closed are cracked open by morning. A soft humming sometimes leaks from the hallway at night, faint and sweet and impossibly familiar. I tell myself it's the wind, but deep down I know better. The last time I walked past my hallway mirror, I caught a glimpse of something small standing behind me, just a shape, just a blur, just long blonde hair brushing the floor. When I turned, nothing was there, but the air tasted like fog, wet and cold, just like that ridge. I haven't reapplied for an elk permit since, and I don't plan to. Some things aren't worth chasing, no matter the tag fee, no matter the challenge, no matter the story you tell yourself about bravery. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the world feels thin, I swear I hear bare feet hovering above the floorboards behind me. She never needed the mountain, she never needed the fog, she only needed my name. Would you dare return to that place? Before you go, listen closely. Nights like this don't end when the story does. Sometimes, the silence that follows is more dangerous than the horror itself. If you feel something watching you right now, don't worry. You're not alone. These shadows stay with everyone who listens. If you want to continue deeper into the darkness, I highly suggest you watch *7 Most Disturbing True Appalachian Mountain Horror Stories. It's waiting for you on the end screen, calling you back into the oldest, coldest secrets those mountains still hide. But be warned, once you step into that world, it clings to you long after the video ends. And before you disappear into the night, make sure you subscribe to Scary Dark Narrations ***. Join the thousands who return every night searching for answers in the dark. Hit that bell icon, because the next story might be the one that follows you into your dreams. Until we meet again, keep your room dim, your doors locked. And whatever you do, don't ignore the feeling that something is standing right behind you in the dark.